Revelation, the most controversial book of the Bible. Within its pages, a dire forecast of apocalypse. Is Revelation prophecy, a vision of things to come, or history that's come and gone? The answer is locked in the book's cryptic words. Are they a code waiting to be cracked, or a riddle never to be solved? What's the real secret of the Book of Revelation? On an ancient battlefield in the Holy Land, the forces of good and evil face off. A sinister figure leads the army of darkness. This is the site of mankind's final battle. A place with a bone-chilling name: Armageddon. This scenario comes not from Hollywood, but the Book of Revelation, the final chapter of the Bible. 2,000 years after it was written, a different battle rages over what it means.
Hands down, it's the most controversial book in the Bible.
To some evangelical Christians, Revelation outlines a doomsday scenario known as the end times. And they say it's unfolding before our eyes.
There is enough going on in the world related to Bible prophecy that I write a daily column. I have for 4 years, every single morning, on something to do with what's going on in the news and how it relates to Bible prophecy.
Obviously, if you're considering the horrible times that are going to come upon this world, you want to let people know what is headed in the future and how to be prepared. God is telling history before it actually happens.
Most scholars say Revelation is a product of its time.
Apocalyptic texts address the issues of their own age, so that the New Testament apocalypse addresses Roman issues. It's about the Roman world and the difficulties in the Roman world, and the hope that Christians can have in the midst of persecution in that Roman world.
It's not supposed to be understood as something literal. It's supposed to be taken symbolically.
Symbols abound in Revelation. So does confusion.
It is like a dream in the sense that we have lots of images that make no sense. They're not coherent in some ways. That if you read the Book of Revelation, you come across great monsters that emerge from the sea, and the red dragon, a messianic warrior, all kinds of plagues that come about.
The author of Revelation speaks of 7 seals, of bowls full of God's wrath, of a great harlot who rides a scarlet beast. What does Revelation really mean? To decipher a book that may foretell the future, you have to revisit the past. The last book of the Bible was written toward the end of the 1st century AD. It circulated throughout Asia Minor as a letter to early Christians. It's called the Revealing, or the Revelation. But it's often known by the original Greek translation of that word, Apocalypse. The author calls himself John. Early Christians believed he was John the Apostle. John was a fisherman in Judea until he met Jesus of Nazareth. John was among the first apostles chosen by Jesus. He became so close to Jesus that he was known as the beloved disciple. When Jesus was crucified, John was the only apostle to remain as a witness. Step by step, the author of Revelation outlines a vision of apocalypse. For 7 years, catastrophe will rock the planet. Quakes from below, and fire from the sky above. Then, a charismatic madman rises to power. He forces every man, woman, and child to accept his mark. 666. Through this numbering system, he controls mankind and rules the world. John calls him the Beast. Believers call him the Antichrist.
And it's unlikely we'll know who he is at first. I believe he's alive today.
Adherents of this apocalypse scenario believe they know how it will unfold. At the peak of his powers, he launches a final battle between good and evil. Armageddon. Most of the Earth's population will die. The end of the world as we know it. To some fundamentalist Christians, this scenario isn't open to interpretation. It's a forecast, a prediction of the inevitable. They base their beliefs on not only Revelation, but select passages from the Old Testament.
Almost 27% of the entire Bible is prophetic in nature. Personally, I don't see how you would interpret the Bible any other way but literally. It makes sense that if God gives his word to us, that he would give it to us in a way that we could understand.
Most Christian theologians read Scripture less literally.
There's a lot of piecing together and interpreting. It's good to recognize that that's what's being done, and sometimes the interpretations are really vigorous and don't have so much to do with the original text.
Popular culture sees Revelation as having to do with some sort of catastrophic end-time event. They see Revelation as predicting the future, whereas scholarship sees Revelation as being addressed to its own circumstances, a call to faithfulness for those early Christians who were living in Asia Minor in the late 1st century.
Not so, say many literalists. They cite another book of the Bible, where Jesus himself warns of doomsday, the Gospel of Matthew. The disciples came unto him, saying, What shall be the sign of thy coming, and the end of the world? And Jesus answered, Ye shall hear of wars and rumors of war. There shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places. When ye see all these things, know that it is near. Matthew chapter 24, verse 3 to 33. Christians who take Revelation as prophecy seek confirmation in today's headlines. Catastrophic weather patterns. Terrifying new plagues. Horrific natural disasters. And deadly madmen, armed with new weapons of destruction. This is the stuff of Revelation.
With the events that are taking place in the world today, I very much believe that we're seeing the stage being set for the fulfillment of Bible prophecy.
Others say the stage is always set. War, famine, plague, and disaster are constants through time. Believers say, this time, it's real. That the clock is ticking, that the countdown has begun. Come 0 hour, the apocalypse begins. It starts with a phenomenon straight out of science fiction. The rapture. If the world began with a big bang, it might end without a sound. The only sign, every Christian on earth will disappear, beamed up to heaven in the blink of an eye. Fundamentalists who believe in a coming apocalypse call it the rapture.
Believers who are alive and remain on the earth will be raptured or caught up or snatched or taken to heaven in an instant, in a moment of time.
What the?
I believe that there'd be the unexplained disappearance of millions of people.
Nurse? Where is everyone?
Left behind, billions of unbelievers to face the end of the world. This interpretation troubles most theologians.
It's always a question for us as to whether or not we should be reading the book of Revelation metaphorically or literally.
I believe very strongly that the book of Revelation should be read as an ancient apocalyptic text. It is ancient, it came out of that world, it belongs in that world, it addresses the issues of that world.
In the 1st century, Rome was the enemy of Christianity. The biggest enemy of all was the Emperor Nero. For him, Christians were a convenient scapegoat. When a great fire devastated Rome in 64 AD, Nero blamed the Christians. He entertained Romans with public crucifixions of Christians. Long after Nero's death, the persecution continued. As a leading Christian, the writer John was also victimized by one of Nero's successors, the Emperor Domitian. John says he was condemned to exile off the coast of Turkey, on a small island of just 13 square miles.
The island of Patmos is a very rugged terrain, and you can see a sense of desolation there.
In this dark hour, John pens a revelation of hope to his fellow Christians. 22 short chapters, but an epic apocalypse. John writes Christ will return and destroy the persecutors.
John's intention is to depict not only the end of time, but perhaps more importantly, the destruction of the Roman Empire. If you're living in a community which is experiencing persecution, the destruction of the Roman Empire is an incredibly hopeful thing.
Typically, apocalyptic texts were written at times of difficulty, when people were going through hard times and were looking for some hope. So these texts are filled with messages of hope, how to cope with the difficulties of the present day, and how to see that God has better plans for the future.
Some who read Revelation as prophecy believe hardship will precede salvation, the salvation of the rapture.
The idea of the rapture has gained its popularity with this movement that history is going downhill and will continue to go downhill until the return of Jesus.
Adherents of the rapture say it comes straight out of the book of Revelation. Most scholars disagree.
The rapture is a very important feature of fundamentalist thinking. It doesn't have anything to do with the book of Revelation. It's pieced together different elements from different parts of the Bible that is then taught as though it comes from the book of Revelation.
In fact, the word rapture appears nowhere in the Bible. Literal believers say the rapture precedes the terror of the tribulation. And there was a great earthquake, such as was not seen since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake, and so great. Revelation chapter 16, verse 18. The gigantic quake that rocked South Asia in 2004 generated a monster tidal wave that killed more than 270,000 people. The deadliest tsunami on record. Some believe the quake was a precursor to greater disasters to come. Believers also say Revelation predicts a global catastrophe from a heavenly body. And there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third of rivers and the fountain of waters, and many men died. Revelation chapter 8, verse 10 to 11. To support their scenario, believers seek evidence in not only scripture, but science. Although large-scale asteroid strikes are rare, believers say a huge asteroid may be destined for Earth. Recent publicity of cosmic near misses convinces many believers that the tribulation is around the corner. And these terrible times of the tribulation are symbolized by four of the most infamous characters in the Bible. The four horsemen of the apocalypse. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth, conquering and to conquer. Revelation chapter 6, verse 2. The white horseman stands for conquest. The red horseman stands for war. The black horseman carries a scale that stands for economic collapse, famine, and hunger. The last horseman is the most feared. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. Revelation chapter 6, verse 8. Believers say the arrival of the four horsemen will signal the beginning of the end. The chaos and destruction of the 7 years of tribulation.
And over half of the Earth's population will die through events that will take place during this 7-year period.
Most scholars say, relax. John wasn't describing a future apocalypse, but a clear and present danger. A feared empire to the east of Rome. The Parthians.
At the end of the first century, any Roman who would read through the book of Revelation would understand that the four horsemen sound like the Parthians galloping against the Roman legions. And they feared the Parthians, in particular, the Parthians on their white horses with their bows and arrows. That would be the image that would resonate with them.
In this apocalypse scenario, the four horsemen pave the way for the darkest figure of all. The Bible calls him the Beast. Adherents of this apocalypse scenario call him the Antichrist. They believe he will lead mankind to a final battle. Armageddon. If the Antichrist appeared on Earth, would you recognize him? The Antichrist will appear as a devil in disguise, or so say believers.
This is going to be the most popular person the world has ever seen. I mean, the guy is going to be a rock star.
Believers in the apocalypse scenario say the Antichrist will one day rule the world and cause suffering never seen before. His true identity will at last be known too late.
And it's unlikely we'll know who he is at first. I doubt he knows who he is, but I believe he's alive today. This is a guy who's got he's got 6,000 years of human history tucked in his head through the inspiration of Satan.
The notion of an Antichrist appears throughout the Bible. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul describes him as the son of perdition. And the 24th chapter of Matthew refers to false Christ and false prophets. Yet in the book of Revelation, the term Antichrist never appears. Instead, John names him the beast. And I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. Revelation chapter 13, verse 1. Ever since Revelation described the beast, believers have struggled to identify him. During the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther called the Pope the Antichrist. The Pope responded by claiming that Luther was the child of Satan. Many dictators from Napoleon to Hitler have been nominated.
The idea of the Antichrist has caught hold in the imagination of a lot of people, and it's been reduced to a single, very evil person who will lead the world under a one world order.
In Revelation, John leaves a clue to his true identity. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. 666. To decode its meaning, some scholars have turned to gematria, an ancient Hebrew practice akin to numerology. The Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, and each letter has a numeric equivalent.
And it turns out that by gematria, which is number symbolism, we can figure out who 666 was.
When biblical historians apply gematria to famous first-century figures, they come up with an exact match for 666.
666 was Nero Caesar, Caesar Nero, the emperor.
Translate the name Caesar Nero from Greek to Hebrew, and the numbers for each letter add up to 666.
He was actually called the Beast by some of his contemporaries, mainly because he was such a bad guy. He was notorious for persecuting Christians, for killing Christians who wouldn't bow to him.
Nero committed suicide before John wrote his Revelation, but his reputation lived on. To some scholars, 666 is a coded message from a Christian exile.
What John is about in that context is an indictment of the Roman imperial cult. John says it cost human lives.
Some fundamentalist Christians disagree. To them, the Antichrist is alive, and he'll use his mark to control mankind. In their scenario, the apocalypse will bring chaos. To survive, each person must accept the mark of the beast, as Revelation predicts. He causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bound, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Revelation chapter 13, verse 16 to 17. In John's day, such marks weren't fantasy, but facts of life.
In ancient times, mark was used to identify individuals. It would be used for soldiers, for slaves.
Identification technology has come a long way since John's day.
It's very possible that biometrics or scan technology, chip implants will be used to enforce that mark.
If I were to pull your Social Security number, if there was some way that I could do that, you'd be socially dead. You couldn't open a bank account, couldn't get a job, couldn't do anything. This is precisely the way that the beast exercises his control, using the mark.
Seems to be the issue here. We got a problem. Hey, come, hey. All right, get out of here.
Doesn't say when. Those who believe the apocalypse scenario say he's among us now.
It all dovetails together with this generation. It can't be any previous generation, neither can it be a subsequent generation.
They point to what they see as a biblical sign, the return of God's chosen people to their ancient homeland, Israel.
What Ezekiel said was that in the last days, God would bring Israel back together, put them on the very same piece of real estate that they had been ejected from 2,520 years before.
In 1948, the nation of Israel was re-established.
From that moment forward, that begins the time clock for the last generation.
Believers say the Antichrist will seize power in Israel. He will occupy a shrine that no longer exists, but will soon be restored. The great Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The vast temple was built by King Solomon around 950 BCE. For 4 centuries, it was the central place of worship for the people of Israel. In 586 BCE, it was destroyed by the Babylonians, then rebuilt by the Jews. In 66 AD, the temple became the center of a Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire. It began when a Jewish priest refused to perform the daily sacrifice on behalf of the Emperor Nero. Nero sent 2 legions to crush the rebellion. In 70 AD, the Romans finally overwhelmed the rebels and burned the temple to the ground.
John and his audience would have been aware that Roman forces captured Jerusalem, burned the temple, and destroyed the city. John would have resented Rome greatly for that.
Few remnants of the temple survive, but a stone retaining wall still stands. The famous Western Wall. It's the holiest site in Judaism. In Revelation, John describes a holy city, a new Jerusalem, built on the site of the destroyed temple.
The rebuilding of a third temple is crucial because what we find in 2 Thessalonians is that the Antichrist will step into this rebuilt Jewish temple. He will proclaim himself as God to be worshipped.
In this view of many contemporary Christians, the Jewish temple has to be rebuilt. This is based on very complicated and very convoluted reading of books that are apocalyptic, like Daniel in the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures, and the book of Revelation.
The question of rebuilding may be moot because a huge obstacle stands in the way.
At present, the Islamic Dome of the Rock sits where the temple should be built. That, of course, is problematic because most Jews don't want to destroy the Dome of the Rock.
Temple or no temple, believers cling to their timeline.
The fact that Israel is back in the land makes us think that the events that are going to take place after the rapture are being prepared.
In this apocalypse scenario, after the split second of rapture and the 7 years of tribulation, mankind helpless before the Antichrist. The next phase, world domination. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him. Revelation chapter 13, verse 7 and 8.
And lady?
Now, the Antichrist gathers his armies and prepares for the mother of all battles, a final showdown between good and evil. The doomsday struggle called Armageddon. According to the doomsday scenario of the book of Revelation, the Antichrist will assemble the largest army ever seen to fight the final battle. Some fundamentalists have even plotted the campaign on the map.
The Antichrist is going to call for all the armies of the world to assemble as a bivouac area to then go another 100 miles south and attack Jerusalem.
The ancient Hebrews called the area Megiddo. The book of Revelation gives it another name, Armageddon. Thanks to Megiddo's strategic location, the Egyptians fought the Canaanites here in 1479 BCE. It's the first recorded battle in history. In Revelation, John claims Megiddo will also give its name to the last battle. According to believers in the apocalypse scenario, only one force stands against the Antichrist. A group of Christian and Jewish refugees who were not raptured, but who have repented.
And so then you have the armies coming south and attacking Jerusalem. And it says that there'll be a big battle there, and half of the city will be taken by the Antichrist.
To describe the battle, the author of Revelation uses coded language. I saw the horses in the vision, and the heads of the horses were as the heads of lions, and out of their mouths issued fire and smoke and brimstone. Revelation chapter 9, verse 17.
Imagine that you lived in the first century where every machine was attached to an animal. A chariot was pulled by a horse and so forth. And suddenly you were transported to a place where you saw the first Gulf War and then had to describe that using the vocabulary of a first century individual. That's why the book of the Revelation sounds so much like it's symbolic.
And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And they had hair as the hair of women, and the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots running to battle. Revelation chapter 9, verse 3 to 9.
And if you look at a picture of an Apache gunship rising up from behind a berm, you see exactly the same description.
Some believers even see a nuclear apocalypse prophesied in the cryptic words of Revelation. And there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. Revelation chapter 9, verse 2. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Revelation chapter 6, verse 13 to 14. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. Believers have even created maps and battle plans based on Revelation's Armageddon. Most Bible scholars reject this scenario.
Now, these texts do assume that there will be some kind of great events that will take place, but it's imagery which is describing all of this. It's not supposed to be understood as something literal. It's supposed to be taken symbolically.
In this dark vision of apocalypse, believers see light. Just as the Antichrist seems on the brink of victory, a miracle occurs. The skies part, and the forces of God himself descend from the heavens. It is the final face-off between Christ and Antichrist. And I saw heaven opened, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war. And the beast was taken. Revelation chapter 19, verse 19 to 20. After an era of tribulation, an eternity of peace. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. Revelation chapter 21, verse 1.
The new heaven and new earth takes us into eternity, and it'll be a glorious age that will never see the presence of sin or wickedness again, but it will be the rule of God for eternity.
Most scholars admire the sentiment, but reject the scenario.
People want so much to see evil defeated that they believe that there's going to be some deus ex machina, God coming into history from outside. Hence, you've got this idea of an apocalypse, which is some kind of a great war, which has to come at the end of days to make possible the perfection that the religion has been pointing to all along.
To many scholars, Revelation has been misread ever since it was written.
Revelation has been especially popular among people who have been seeing the end of the world coming soon. And its imagery, being so symbolic, has often been fit to adapt to the circumstances in which we find ourselves.
Every time there were major world events, there has been a tendency to believe that this must be the time.
Till kingdom come, Revelation will be debated. Perhaps because how it was written is as mysterious as what it means. Even its author is a mystery.
We have no idea who wrote much of the New Testament. It was very common for early Jews and Christians to write in the names of famous people in the faith.
Early Christians traditionally believed Revelation was written by the Apostle John. John is known for the gospel that bears his name. Yet forensic evidence suggests another John penned Revelation. Exhibit A, style. The Gospel of John reads nothing like the book of Revelation.
The Greek of the Gospel is pure and simple Greek. The Greek of the book of Revelation is really quite atrocious.
Exhibit B, chronology. Revelation was written around 95 AD. By then, the Apostle John would have been close to 100 years old, or more likely, dead. Who really wrote Revelation? The mystery will likely endure, like the book itself. To those who read it as prophecy, the messenger matters less than the message. The end is coming.
I believe that we're approaching these end times. Taking those prophecies and looking at our current world, it very much looks as though God is setting the stage for the fulfillment of end-time events. I expect to see the rapture in my lifetime.
Yet when it was written, Revelation had a different title with a different meaning: Apocalypse.
Originally, apocalypse doesn't mean anything more than unveiling, somehow learning the secrets that only the deities know. But in modern usage, it's come to stand for end of the world because we so much associate it with the book of Revelation.
Among Christians, the book's power may lie not in the accuracy of its forecasts, but the impact on behavior.
There have been times when people have taken the book of Revelation very seriously and acted in ways that were revolutionary or even destructive, as we saw with David Koresh and the Branch Davidians.
In 1993, near Waco, Texas, a group of Davidians led by David Koresh waged a 51-day standoff with the FBI. The Branch Davidians are a small Christian sect who believe in the doomsday prophecies of Revelation. The siege ended in a fiery apocalyptic scene where 80 men, women, and children perished. In the 20th century, there were numerous doomsday panics. In 1918, some believed that the worldwide Spanish flu epidemic was a biblical plague that would wipe out humanity. But the epidemic passed. Mankind survived. Still, many believers of the apocalypse scenario are on guard.
As I believe that Christ could return at any moment, that's going to cause me to live in a certain manner that I don't want to be caught off guard.
Throughout history, Revelation has convinced believers to prepare for the end. For some, the end came, but not as they predicted. The end is near. So say those who take the book of Revelation literally.
I believe this is the last generation of human beings before the return of Christ. We've run out of time. We've run out of space. We've run out of room. We've run out of ideas. We've run out of pretty much everything. And we must be getting close to the end.
Most scholars say it's déjà vu all over again. In nearly every era, some people believe the world is ending based on their own interpretation of Revelation.
We've entered a new age after the 9/11 attacks and the War on Terror. And once again, people are looking to the book of Revelation to find the kinds of things in it that would justify the notion that the end is near.
One of the things we find about apocalyptic belief is that every generation thinks it's special. Every generation thinks it will see the end of the world because it's the most corrupt period of time. And if we look at this historically, we'll see this over and over again.
365 AD, Poitiers, France. A bishop named Hilary becomes convinced the end is near.
So he starts telling people to prepare for the end. Nothing happens. It really didn't seem to faze him or change his image that much because in the 19th century, Hilary of Poitiers became a saint.
In the 15th century, in the city of Tabor, in what's now the Czech Republic, a group called the Taborites starts an entire movement based on their belief the end is near. They form a guerrilla army and spread their ideas at sword point.
They were actually going around burning churches. They would kill anyone who they identified as a sinner. And the basic criteria for being identified as a sinner is that you weren't within their movement.
In 1434, the Taborites are crushed, their leaders killed. In the 19th century in the United States, another apocalyptic movement springs up, led by an army captain turned Baptist preacher named William Miller.
He comes to the conclusion, based on his own private study of the book of Daniel, that the rapture is going to occur sometime in 1843 or 1844.
As time goes on, Miller pinpoints when the exact day will come, between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. The intervening year comes and goes, but still no rapture. Miller rechecks his figures and arrives at a new date, October 22nd, 1844. By now, Miller has attracted an estimated 50,000 disciples. On the eve of the big day, some give away all their worldly possessions. Some even purchase special ascension robes for the occasion.
When that date comes around, all of his followers gather on the hillsides. They get together praying, and they're singing hymns, they're chanting, they've got their hands lifted up to heaven.
The next day is known to Miller's followers as the Great Disappointment.
It doesn't really faze Miller because he goes on to continue predicting the second coming almost every year until he dies. Of course, he made a lot of money on the ascension robes, and so he's got something invested in that.
The problem with predicting the end of time is so far that everyone who's predicted it, from John of Patmos to the Y2Kers, has been wrong.
To scholars, Revelation is so open to interpretation, it can mean almost anything.
I think that the book of Revelation is almost like a Rorschach blot. People see in it what they're predisposed to find. If they're looking for signs of the end, what they'll do is they'll find correlations between the images in the book of Revelation and their own time and place.
Some scholars believe literalists miss the whole point.
I would say that it's not a message of terror as most people think. It is not primarily a message announcing the end of the world. It's primarily a message of hope and reassurance that communicates that God ultimately and finally has the last word.
That message barely made it into the Bible. In the 4th century AD, many bishops debated whether the book of Revelation should even be in the Bible.
Lots of folks objected to the kind of violence that they found in the book of Revelation. It's also somewhat socially radical, very critical of the Roman Empire.
But the majority of church fathers agreed the book was part of the Word of God, and Revelation became the last book of the Bible. Perhaps the early Christian writers saw what the clerics missed. Every great book needs a big finish. The debate over Revelation continues. To some, it's an omen of doom.
This year, the world is coming to a standstill for football's most prestigious event. We'll bring you deeper and further into the game. Planet Football starts Monday on the National Geographic Channel.
Or between the lines. One thing both sides agree on. The debate will likely rage till the end of the world.